This is joint work with Alexander Bollerer from Georgia Tech and Samuel Jarrett and Christina Nito-Rutaro from Purdue University. So let me just spend one slide to give you some motivational context for this problem that we're trying to solve in this paper. And it's all about minimizing latency. As we know, with proliferation of mobile and web applications, latency has certainly become a very huge deal on the internet of today. The internet is a very competitive environment. Users are becoming more and more content hungry and certainly very impatient with latency. So some previous studies have shown, for example, that users might visit a website less often if it is slower, just by a quarter of a second. And another study has shown that Amazon can lose up to 1% in its sales just because of latency for as little as 1/10 of a second. So we know that bandwidth is cheap and will continue to grow, but there's a fundamental limitation in what we can do about latency. And it has to do with the fact that information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. So unless we can figure out how to travel faster than the speed of light, or build tunnels in Earth, or maybe move to a smaller planet, pretty much we are faced with the following challenge, which has to do with minimizing the number of RTTs, or round-trip times, required to establish a connection, and hopefully without sacrificing security, of course. So this is exactly where QUIC comes in. QUIC is basically Google's answer to the latency challenge. It stands for Quick UDP Internet Connections, so it runs on top of UDP, which is a transmission layer protocol. It was intended for web content delivery, and it was developed and deployed by Google in the Chrome browser in 2013. And so it's mainly intended to produce security protection comparable to that of TLS, but reduce connection, at the same time, reduce connection latency. And that is exactly the question that we try to target in the study. Can QUIC actually do this in presence of attackers? So let me spend a couple of slides to give you just an idea of why this question is actually non-trivial. And what I will do is I'll compare QUIC and TLS. So let's first start with setup time. We all use TLS when we want to securely access a bank account online or maybe email, but TLS runs over TCP, which means that in order to exchange data with TLS, we first have to go through a handshake associated with a TCP connection, and then another handshake associated with TLS key establishment. And so what QUIC tries to do is, in some sense, combine these two handshakes into one, so the connection establishment and key agreement can happen pretty much at the same time, sort of, and thereby cut the latency in half. And so there are, of course, some benefits to using TCP, such as it guarantees ordered delivery and also provides some protection against connection spoofing. But as we see here, it adds to latency. And also, we know that it suffers from subtle performance degradation attacks, such as TCP reset. And these kinds of attacks have been recently have gained some notoriety, as it was found out that they were used for censorship by some governments, because they're kind of subtle. So the question is, well, what about QUIC? How does QUIC deal with these issues? And let me now talk about data exchange in QUIC versus TLS. So in TLS, in order to exchange data, you have to first establish a session key. And then you can use that key to encrypt the data that you're trying to exchange. But in QUIC, things are slightly different. It actually looks like it has more stages, but in reality is that you can start exchanging data before you establish the final session key. And this data exchange happens with the initial key. And at the same time as you exchange data with the initial key, you can also establish the final session key. And the main benefit of this is that the parties can often avoid in practice, when they use QUIC, one RTT in the initial key establishment of QUIC by caching some of the protocol-specific parameters. And that what this allows them to do in practice is to experience zero RTT connections. In other words, they don't actually have to wait for any RTTs before they start sending data in the initial data exchange phase where they use the initial key. But the question is, what implication does this optimization have on the security? Now, before I go on, I'd like to mention a very closely related work to our study from last year in CCS. The authors of this study have mainly focused on the key establishment phase of the QUIC protocol. And what they have done is developed a security definition for multi-stage key agreements, and they have shown that QUIC meets their definition. And what they've also shown is that if you modify the data exchange part of QUIC and sort of compose it together with the key establishment phase of QUIC, then together you can sort of show that they're secure. However, the question is, what about security of the whole protocol as it actually is? In other words, how it is implemented without any modifications. And furthermore, what about its latency guarantees in presence of attackers? And the reason why this question is kind of important, because after all, QUIC is not just some kind of hypothetical protocol used to study in academia, but it's actually being deployed and used. And these are exactly the questions that we target in our study. What provable security guarantees does QUIC provide, and under which assumptions? And furthermore, how effective is QUIC at minimizing latency in presence of attackers? The second question is a little bit more operational, and it has to do with not necessarily security, but how you can degrade performance of QUIC in some subtle ways that are hard to detect. So let me give you a very brief summary of our results. So we develop a security definition that is suitable for performance-driven protocols, kind of like QUIC, and we show that QUIC satisfies our security definition. This requires a very rigorous kind of approach. We show that QUIC does not satisfy the traditional notion of forward secrecy provided by some TLS variants, like, for example, TLS DHE. Let me remind you that forward secrecy is the property that if the communicating parties are ever compromised and their state gets revealed, if there's forward secrecy, then their communication that happened before the compromise cannot be leaked. And with respect to the second question, we show with simple attacks on some of the parameters of the protocol, it's actually easy to prevent QUIC from achieving its minimal latency goals. And we have implemented all of these attacks, and we show that they're practical and effective at degrading QUIC's performance. So in the rest of this talk, I would like to talk about provable analysis that we've done about QUIC. And after that, I will talk about our performance degradation attacks against QUIC, and then I will conclude with a summary and future work. So let me first give you a little bit more details about how QUIC works and also point out some of its complexities. So imagine we have a client and a server. The client has not yet connected to the server ever before, so it picks a connection ID, which is just a random string, sends a connection request to the server. The server then generates what's called a source address token, which basically plays is somewhat analogous to a SYN cookie in TCP, and then sends it back along with a parameter called server config, which contains the server's public Diffie-Hellman values. And then if everything's OK and the signature on the server config verifies, the client produces its own Diffie-Hellman values, sends them back. The server verifies the source address token, and then they can establish the initial key and exchange data before they actually get the final session key. Now, during the initial data exchange is when the server can now produce Diffie-Hellman values that are dedicated specifically for this session, send them to the client encrypted under the initial key, and then after that they can derive the new session final key and exchange data under this final key. So this is a very busy slide, but the main point here is that the SDK, the source address token, and the server config can actually be reused in what's called a connection resumption. This is exactly where QUIC gets interesting. Okay. Wait, hold on a second. Okay, so in connection resumption, imagine that the client already has contacted the server before. So all it has to do is pick a new connection ID, and it can reuse the source address token and the server config file parameter as long as they're not expired. And what it allows to do is to basically shave off a whole RTT from the connection. And if you think about it, what this means is actually the client can start exchanging data with the server with basically zero RTT connection, but under the initial key. So the bottom line here is with use of cacheable parameters in QUIC, you can actually achieve zero RTT connections under the initial key. However, this introduces some potential complexities. Specifically, because the client cannot initially check SDK authenticity from the server, if it ever gets corrupted for any reason, malicious or non-malicious, this can potentially lead to inconsistent view of the handshake, which can be bad because it may mean that two parties have a different view of the conversation and potentially establish distinct initial keys. And another issue is that compromising the server before the server config actually expires can reveal data encrypted under the initial key that was derived with the server config, which basically breaks the forward secrecy. So generally, provable security analysis requires a very rigorous approach with a security model and a proof. But so as not to bore you, I would actually would like to go through some of the challenges that we faced in our security analysis, and just to give you a very high-level overview. So first of all, there was a lot of previous work in TLS in the crypto community. But unfortunately, this is not very suitable. It's very relevant, but it's not suitable. And this is, again, because data in QUIC can be exchanged in the initial data phase where the initial key is used before the session key is actually established. In QUIC, parties can potentially sometimes set distinct initial keys. And what this means is the traditional notion of having a matching conversation is not suitable here, because parties can potentially set distinct keys in the initial key establishment stage. And so for that, we need a new notion of what it means to set a key with a party to capture data privacy when data is encrypted under different keys. The server config is publicly available and can be reused as long as it is not expired. And what this means is that we need a weaker notion for forward secrecy, specifically tailored to initial keys. However, the traditional notion should still apply to forward secrecy. Traditional notion of forward secrecy should still apply for final session keys. And finally, as I mentioned before, QUIC does not run on top of TCP, it runs on top of UDP, which does not address the unordered delivery and spoofing. And so we need to capture attacks involving misordering and selectively delaying and dropping packets, as well as potential connection spoofing in our definition. So these are some of the things that we had to deal with, and to address these challenges, we had to come up with a new protocol model that is suitable for these kinds of protocols that we call QUIC communications. And we also developed a security notion appropriate for these kinds of protocols that we call QUIC authenticated and confidential channel establishment. So let me very informally present you our main result with respect to security of QUIC. So we find that QUIC meets our notion of security as long as the underlying signature scheme that it uses is strongly unforgeable under the chosen message attack. This is a standard security notion for digital signatures. And to that effect, QUIC supports two very well-known signature schemes. Also, the underlying authenticated encryption with associated data scheme, this is what QUIC uses to actually encrypt the data, has to satisfy the following two pretty standard well-known security notions: the indistinguishability and authentication security. To that effect, QUIC uses what's called AES Galois counter mode, or GCM, which has been shown to be provably secure in previous work. And we also use a couple of pretty well-known standard assumptions in our analysis that I won't talk too much about here in the interest of time. So let's now shift gears to the second portion of a talk where I tell you about our performance attacks against QUIC. So let me start by giving a very general overview of what types of attacks we're talking about here. The first type of attack is based on replaying public cacheable content, such as, for example, the server config and the source address token, SDK. And this kind of attacks results in fooling client and or server parties in trying to achieve a connection and maintain some kind of state, and thereby waste resources. The second type of attack is based on manipulating unprotected packet fields, such as the connection ID and the SDK again. And this kind of attacks leads clients and servers to have a distinct view of the key establishment phase and potentially lead to failure to establish a session key, and therefore a connection failure, and again, a waste of time and lots of latency. So to summarize these attacks, both of the types of the attacks cause servers and clients to waste time and resources, and they, of course, introduce a lot of latency. They ironically stem from the parameters whose purpose was actually to minimize latency in QUIC, such as the server config and the SDK. And most importantly, these attacks do not concern data authenticity and confidentiality. Again, the point of these attacks is just to grade the performance of the protocol. This is a table that summarizes all of the attacks that we have implemented. We targeted the QUIC Chromium implementation from October of last year. And we've implemented all of our attacks in Python with Python Scapy library. I will not have time to go into details of any of these attacks, but the main point is that these attacks can be used to deny clients of any choice, right, to have access to any application of any choice, or cause them to waste time and resources, and potentially also lead a service to waste resources and maybe a denial of service attack. The reason why these attacks are interesting is unlike just plainly dropping or delaying packets, they're actually quite subtle. They're sort of part of the protocol. And they're very hard to detect, and we believe that this is something that governments or just organizations in general could potentially use for purposes of censorship. So now I'd like to conclude the talk with a summary. So we have, in this study, developed a security definition for performance-driven protocols, such as QUIC, and we have shown that QUIC meets our definition, with some caveats, of course, with respect to forward secrecy. We have implemented 5 different practical performance degradation attacks against QUIC, and we have shown that they're very effective at degrading QUIC's performance. Now, the main point of this study was not necessarily to say that QUIC is a good protocol or bad protocol, or whether it should be deployed or not. It is already deployed. But the point is just here to demonstrate the inherent trade-off between performance and security. In some sense, what we're trying to say is that there's no free lunch when it comes to the trade-off between latency and security. If you want to minimize latency, potentially you'll have to give up some security properties. And finally, we believe that our security definitions are general enough and could be used to analyze other protocols in the future, such as, for example, TLS version 1.3. So thank you very much for your attention. Please look for the full version that should be available on ePrint as well as off of the authors' websites. For all the details with respect to definitions, proofs, the attacks we have implemented, we also compare them against various kinds of attacks against TLS, and also provide some very high-level mitigation strategies. And I'd be happy now to take any questions.
So my name is Mike Patullo. I'm from the United States Military Academy. I should disclose before I ask my question, the research I'm going to talk about here is I was involved in. We presented at CCS 2013. So I just wondered if you had come across the protocol Minimalt, which in fact does not sacrifice per forward security in order to achieve the minimal latency of QUIC.
I myself have not, and in fact there was a paper from a while ago, I believe Ron Canetti was part of it, that actually sort of in some sense hinted that there's going to be always this kind of trade-off between latency in the setup and forward secrecy.
Okay, so I think we showed with Minimalt that the trade-off is less than perhaps you proposed. And there's a paper near.
I'm sorry, could you speak a little bit
louder?
louder?
I'm sorry. I said I think you'll find if you read the Minimalt paper. Now, of course, we don't have the backing of Google, so the deployment is not what QUIC is, and you mentioned that in your talk, of course. So, Minimalt has that disadvantage as of today, but I think in our work we showed that the trade-off is perhaps less than you state. So I'd encourage you and others to perhaps look at that Minimalt paper.
Okay, yes, thank you. I will definitely check it out.
Just a historic note. I might be wrong on the details here, but I believe that the method that QUIC uses was developed by Whit Diffie in 1980.
Oh, well, I mean, that's, I think, before I was born, but great. I'll check out that work. I guess the point is I'm not trying to sell QUIC as a protocol. The point is it was actually implemented, and the important part of this work was to actually study something that was implemented, right?